Welcome. I'm Deborah Lustig. I'm the academic coordinator for the Center for Research on Social Change, a sponsor of today's talk, and I'm also one of the training coordinators for the ISSI Graduate Fellows Program, along with Christine and David. And it's really a special day for us to have one of our alums, Eric Pido, here with us. I want to thank our co-sponsor for the event, the Department of Ethnic Studies here on campus. And before I get started, I wanted to mention an upcoming event, also featuring an alum, although I promise you not all of our events are like that. Willow Lung Amen, Assistant Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Maryland, College Park, will be giving a talk on her new book, Trespassers, Asian Americans and the Battle for Suburbia, and that will be on Tuesday, November 14th from 12 to 1:30 here in this room. Could you please turn off or silence your cell phones or anything else you have with you that might make noise? In today's event, Professor Pido will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. We also will have the books available for sale and signing after the event. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Eric Pido, Associate Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University, where he works with his students and his teaching to promote socially engaged community activism and knowledge for good. He has a PhD from UC Berkeley in ethnic studies, and as I said, he was a graduate fellow here. He was also a wonderful member of our community who gave in so many ways. If you are interested, you can watch our oral history video on the CRSC website. He was one of the videographers for that, and he's also the narrator. Today he's going to share some of the material from his recently published book, Migrant Returns, Manila Development and Transnational Connectivity. And I think you're going to see what the promise that we saw in his work to make important theoretical interventions in the realm of transnationalism, and to look closely at what's happening on the ground both in California and the Philippines, and illuminate that in a new way. He's also published his research in the journals Verge, Studies in Global Asias, Journal of Asian American Studies, and Ethnic and Racial Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pido.
Thank you so much for coming to the talk. You never know who's going to come to these talks, so I really appreciate you spending the noon with me. It's a really special moment for me because this space was one of the only places on this campus where I really felt like my ideas were understood, acknowledged, and really manifested especially through the work of Christine, David, and Deborah. They were incredible mentors to me when what was then the Institute for the Study of Social Change. So I want to thank the three of you very, very much, because I literally wrote the first page of this book here. And it's amazing to be able to see it materialize. This idea of materialization and how ideas, the imagination becomes materialized is a central component of today's talk. I hope you're not too thrown off by the title. I promise it's not that different than what was scheduled. And from the title, The Afterlife of Migration, I know already that this is a very different kind of talk than maybe the one that you're used to if you've been to previous talks at the Institute. But I promise this is also not as humanistic as it appears. There's a lot of social science in here too. But nonetheless, I was always kind of an anomaly. Even when I came here into the Institute, the project that I ended up working on, which eventually got published into an article, was a very sort of different kind of article that tends to come out of this institute. And again, I was so grateful that my mentors here were able to see what it was that I was trying to materialize. Around 2008, what I had noticed when I originally wanted to study real estate in Daly City and Filipino realtors was that there were just a huge spike in Filipinos who were losing their homes and getting evicted. And so I was doing my interviews. There was a lot of ambivalence in my interviews, and it was actually quite difficult to have these conversations. So I thought to myself, in the midst of these interviews, why don't I think about this more? And one of the questions that I wrestled with in my mind was, why did so many Filipino families buy homes if they couldn't afford it? A lot of these Filipino families, just like a lot of families during 2006, 2007, and 2008, lost their homes because they had refinanced their homes several times. But in the case of Filipinos, I wondered why it was so high. Social science literature, when they think about the proclivity of immigrants to purchase property, it's constantly thought of it in this very economistic model, that it's a very rational choice. And as immigrants come here into the United States, it's just obvious that as you're assimilating, you're going to go ahead and purchase a home. Well, when I was doing these interviews, what I realized is it wasn't exactly that. What I realized through my interviews, through the way that this practice of trying to navigate American society and American culture imbibed this kind of performativity. And so what I argued in this article was that purchasing homes for a lot of immigrants, especially Filipinos, was a way of articulating a kind of belonging in this country, marked by the performance of the things like the American dream. When you go to Daly City, you see what seems like a prototypical suburb, but it's not exactly the kind of ethnoburb that a lot of scholars write about, where the ethnic community or the ethnic identity of that community is so obvious within the landscape. In Daly City, there's a lot of, veiledness. As a scholar, I'm always interested in this idea of what's hidden, beneath this Du Boisian veil. There's the multiple consciousness, the double, triple, quadruple consciousness that operate beneath this veil. And Daly City is rife with this hiddenness. And what you have to do is you kind of have to look for the Filipino-ness inside of Daly City. But the thing is, it's almost 65% Filipino. So as I was thinking about this performativity of citizenship, of belonging through purchasing homes and trying to act American, what I also was struggling with was the ways that Filipinos kind of materialize their belonging in Daly City, which wasn't very obvious. And I ended up reading a book by one of my colleagues. He was an anthropologist who used to teach in my department, Benito Vergara. He wrote an entire book about Daly City. And this is This is one of the quotes that stood out to me constantly as I was thinking about how Filipino immigrants and immigrants in general express and materialize their connectedness with their built environment. Sonny Vergara, he writes, whether manifested as political activism, assertions of ethnic pride, nostalgia, consumerism, or just vague remembering, the repeated turning is obliquely opposed to the narrative of assimilation. The tension between this remembrance and the demands of citizenship in their new homeland and the obligations in different directions constitute a predicament for the Filipino immigrant. I was really struck by this idea of the repeated turning, the literal always looking back from where I came. I think this is such a fundamental aspect of the immigrant experience that isn't always communicated. I think within immigrants there's always this compulsion that's not always visible to maybe not return in the physical sense, but to go back to the homeland. I think most immigrants share this experience, even if the homeland was a place of hardship and violence. I think there's so much about the immigrant imagination that leads immigrants to constantly repeatedly turn back and imagine this homeland that they had left. Social science literature, political science literature, and economic literature, they don't consider these things, these very immaterial things. A lot of the decisions that immigrants make, according to that literature and according to their frameworks, are obvious. They're rational. But what my research wants to really try to convey is, how do we understand immaterial things? Fantasies, imaginations, dreams, longings, fears. How do we imagine immaterial things having a very material effect on the built environment? And so that's what led me to begin thinking about the Philippines. But not the Philippines over there, but as one of my beloved mentors said, the United States as an extension of the Philippines. Daly City is an extension of Manila. It's difficult to have this conversation both with myself and with my colleagues, because understanding cities and how cities form is constantly enmeshed in this framework that's incredibly economistic. The idea of global cities, as espoused in different ways, is such a predominant way of understanding how cities emerge and how cities sustain themselves throughout the global economy. Most of you are familiar with work by people like Manuel Castells, Saskia Sassen. So many different urban theorists understand the global market, the global economy, to operate from very central nodes. These nodes operate in a hierarchy. There are some that are more important, while there are others that are semi-peripheral. The point being is that all of these cities operate in a network where capital, finance, culture are extracted from some places and moved into the core. Even frameworks that are critical of this model still employ this idea of the core periphery. The entire school of world systems theory, which has been so central in critiquing sort of the exploitive nature of the global systems, is still operates from this core periphery model. The problem with that comes with the cities that aren't within these nodes or within this network. According to the global systems theory, the world systems theory, and the global cities framework, if you're not within these nodes, well, you just become illegible. You just become invisible. And so when I'm trying to understand cities, not just like Manila, but cities like Daly City, it's very hard to even have a conversation about why it's important to talk about these cities, because it makes complete sense. They're not visible. So when I think about not just cities that are completely within the periphery of the eye of global capital, cities like Daly City, ethnoburbs like that, are not only difficult to make sense of, but why immigrants would return in the first place to countries that most people think are poor or less important than the countries that they settled in. This literature sort of lends itself to, it complements the literature on the global cities. When most scholars try to understand return, it's such a novel idea. It's not important, because they tend to explain it in this sort of way. There's really two reasons why immigrants return to their homelands. One is this idea of a life cycle. Depending on where you are in your life, it may just be time for you to return back to your homeland because you're old enough, you've done everything that you needed to do for your family and taking care of their security, and so now it's time to return. The other very rational model is this idea of the target earner, the person who has figured out that they've accrued enough capital and done enough things to sort of secure their lifestyle, and so now it's time to return. These two models of understanding migrant return or return migration, it's really helpful in the sense, it's really powerful actually, in the sense that the agency is always given to the migrant themselves. The migrant makes the decision to leave, and they make the decision to return. Based on different external factors, it's always the migrant who's choosing to do that. But as we all know, or as a lot of us know, us who are children of immigrants, and especially those of us who are immigrants ourselves, it's never that clean. Immigrants don't always get to choose the things that they want to do in terms of changing or improving or bettering their lifestyle. Things like refugee migration or forced migration. How do economists and political scientists and sociologists explain how they would even want to return to their homelands? But what we find in our interviews and in the literature is that many, many of them do. So what is this compulsion? A lot of my research wants to look at how these compulsions, these dreams, these fantasies, the imagination is propelling just as much as the economic factors, this return back home. I call this this production, this circulation, imaginative laboring. It's trying to articulate just how important and vital things that are immaterial are in enabling, well, the global economy to actually function and move. There are signs like this all over Daly City, especially around the Mission neighborhood as it borders the top of the hill of Daly City, because there's so many working class and first generation immigrants who live in that nexus. These signs obviously communicate the importance of remittances, the financial and material gifts that immigrants living in one place are sending back to their homeland. Remittances, return migration, all of these things tend to be encoded by the framework of the life cycle migration model. Of course, immigrants would want to send money back home because they're working here temporarily, or they may be working here for a while, but their family back home needs the money. What's interesting, however, is that there are so many questions that one can't explain using those models. For instance, why it is that even now in 2017, out-migration from the Philippines just continues. It's just continuous. In fact, the Philippines is the second largest sender of labor abroad. Why? Why does that happen? Why is it that there are certain countries that depend on out-migration when we know out-migration does little to improve the local or the national economy? Similarly, remittances don't expand a country's economy or their GDP. What they end up doing is they end up sustaining very particular aspects of that country's economy, but it's not rational that a country would simply depend on these two things. Well, the literature around remittances, because they understand flows of capital in these very basic ways, the assumption is that remittances, well, they're just an obvious byproduct of global migration. You move from the periphery into the core, and so this is just one of the byproducts.
Can you just explain those numbers again, what we're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so sorry. So on the left side is the actual numbers per year in 2003 of migrants from the Philippines going to certain regions in the world.
So it's within Asia?
Asia, the Middle East, Europe, the Americas, but primarily North America, Canada.
From all of that is the Philippines
going to those countries, yeah. And on the right side are the amount of remittances in 2003 that were sent by these migrants. I wanted to show this graph. Thank you so much for asking that question. I wanted to show this graph just as a point of comparison. In 2003 or 2014, what's interesting is one, that these numbers have increased, some exponentially. But two, the places in which migrants from the Philippines are mostly going are countries in the Middle East, countries that are highly exploitive, very difficult for Filipinos to work in. But the largest amount of remittances actually come from North America. What isn't often talked about when it comes to remittances is the way that remittances materialize, not simply in terms of finances or actual hard currency. One of the most common sort of terminology or ways that Filipinos understand migration and people understand Filipino migration is through the idea of the balikbayan box. It's not just chocolate candies, but it's seized chocolates candies. It's candies that were so popular, maybe not in 2010 or 2017, but certainly in a very particular moment between the historical relationship between the Philippines and the United States. It's not just perfumes or lotions. It's perfumes and lotions from Bath and Body Works. It's important to understand gift-giving or charity or material remittances. It's not simply just for their monetary value, but for their cultural significance. There's a lot of imaginative work that's happening based on what kinds of items you're sending back to your family members. When I went back to the Philippines on one of my field trips, I went actually to the center of the Philippines, a region called the Visayas, that was hit particularly hard in 2007 by one of the many typhoons that constantly plague the Philippines. And I was just struck by the scene that I was seeing as I was walking off of the ferry. I saw this woman who was speaking in Taglish. She wasn't even speaking Ilonggo, the dialect of the people who live in this part of the Philippines. She was speaking in Taglish and telling them to be careful as these two men were hurling over their shoulders a huge plasma screen television and a stereo system, and all I could see is Sony, right? Sony DVD player. And it was sort of a jarring, kind of discombobulating image because I knew that woman didn't live here. I knew that from her language, from her clothing, from her mannerisms, that she was a balikbayan, somebody who was returning from the Philippines and visiting the Philippines for the family. And I also knew that this region was hit very hard by this typhoon, so it was very strange to see these items coming out of the hull of the ferry, because they weren't things that you think are necessary in order for a family to recover from a typhoon. Things like a refrigerator or furniture. I mean, there was a plasma screen television. I think social scientists have a very difficult time reconciling this idea that they call conspicuous consumption. These things that immigrants choose to spend their money on that doesn't fit a kind of rational savings model. But as I sort of refracted my gaze and looked at Iloilo, where this city had been rocked by this typhoon, I saw streets that had still, for months, hadn't been repaired. I saw storefronts that were still boarded up, homes after homes that were still torn down from the typhoon. Much like Puerto Rico, for months, this is where that happened. One moment in Puerto Rico, this is a yearly, annual thing that happens to the Philippines. And what I realized was that the local government wasn't the one who was tasked with repairing Iloilo. It was their families. Their families weren't just sending televisions or sound systems. They were ensuring the sustainability of their futures. The job of fixing the infrastructure and also fixing these households was left to the Filipinos in the diaspora, especially balikbayans. Vicente Rafael, a Filipino historian and anthropologist, he's like an anthropologist. He pays a lot of attention to culture. He talked about what I call imaginative laboring in this very specific way. When he thinks about things like remittances, he says, the labor of mourning, the work that mourning does to repair and reproduce capital, tends to bring forth the uncanny nature of capitalist development itself, on which the nation state depends. The moral economy of breathing is persistently haunted by the circulation of money. I call my talk today the afterlife of migration, of course, to sort of respond to theories around return migration that see return migration as a rational sort of stopping point in the migration life cycle. A lot of scholars, particularly post-colonial scholars, have talked about the afterlife of empire. This idea that empire didn't produce the effects that colonial administrators and colonizers thought that it would. In fact, this life cycle model was actually mirrored by a lot of colonial models that understood development processes. We come into this country, and through the introduction of our civilization, the ways of our innovation and technology, this society would progress. This literature on the afterlife of empire, however, suggests that not only did post-colonial countries not end in the way that colonizers thought that they would, but the empire itself didn't go where colonizers thought it would go. This afterlife, the things like the haunting of empire and capitalist development is something that I think about a lot when I think about why it is that Filipinos maintain and sustain the relationships that they have with their family members back home. It's important at this point for me to define this term, balikbayan. I wanted to show you this ad, however. This is one of the trillions of real estate ads that you'll see all over the Philippines. This ad says, I am a hero, I am a Maya. Kaya ko na. It's this idea of being a hero, it's not just abstract. Filipino scholars talk a lot about migrants who leave the Philippines to work in these very harsh conditions as heroes to the nation. I wanted to bring your attention to this, to the description of the ad. A Maya Escapes makes it possible for you to own the home you deserve. Very liberal idea, right? The home that you deserve. Every Amaya home is beautifully and thoughtfully designed. It is where dreams are fulfilled and where family life flourishes. The balikbayan landscape produced by this concept called the balikbayan economy that I tried to articulate in my book are underpinned by these two ideas that are so central to understanding how Filipinos understand themselves in relation to the nation. One, this idea of dreams, and two, this idea of family. I need to decode three different groups of people who tend to be conflated with one another when it comes to thinking about flows of migration and especially retirement in the Philippines. This is a customs form which denotes that even the Filipino government understands that there are clear distinctions between the groups of people who come into the Philippines. And these distinctions are important because they all have economic and financial consequences. When people think about retirees to the Philippines, they often this imaginary, right, of this North American or European white man who perhaps married a Filipina is coming now to the Philippines to enjoy their life, take a break and enjoy their life. But the two types of migrant groups that I want to talk about and focus on are these two. The overseas Filipino workers. Overseas Filipino workers are oftentimes not as economically privileged and certainly find themselves in working conditions that are very different from this other group of people, the balikbayans. Balikbayans, which literally means one who returns home, doesn't immediately conjure a distinction between these two groups. In a lot of ways, these two groups are seen as one and the same. But in the vernacular, in the everyday usage of this term, it's very clear who the balikbayans are versus who are OFWs. OFWs are the real heroes, whereas balikbayans are the ones who left the Philippines and chose to leave for good. They tend to find themselves not only in more economically advantaged workplaces and employment, but oftentimes are thought of as being ones who come from places like Canada, the United States, Australia, and maybe even the UK. But it's so important to recognize that there are a lot of first-generation immigrants, undocumented Filipino immigrants, and overseas Filipino workers living in San Francisco alone. But in the imagination, what's important is the class distinction between these two groups. Let me just give you a quick sort of historical context to this balikbayan economy. A reason why so many Filipinos ended up comprising the majority of not only Daly City, but Pinole, Hercules, Union City, is largely because of this moment in American history. In 1965, America was experiencing a tremendous change in its economic fabric. We call that change and transformation deindustrialization. Well, as this transformation was happening, people in Congress understood very well that there weren't enough skilled workers in order to make this transition happen. And so it had opened the door to migration for a particular group of immigrants. Immigrants who were skilled and educated. When people in Congress, if you look at the congressional record, when people of Congress sort of looked back at the effects of the 1965 immigration, you can hear in the record their dismay. They were so surprised that people from Europe, people from Norway, Germany, and France didn't actually want to come to the United States. They knew that there would be a huge circulation of migrants from Mexico, but putting that aside, if you look at the record, they completely intended this migration to come from Western and maybe even parts of Southern Europe. But what ended up happening instead was a tremendous influx of immigrants, skilled and educated immigrants from Asia. And the largest Asian group to come from this migration were educated and skilled migrants who were very educated in particular niches in employment, which is why we have so many nurses who work in the Philippines today. And this moment in American history also conveys how it is that when people think of how Filipinos and other Asians are racially, even though there's tremendous diversity in this one racial category, they think of them as skilled and educated, a model minority. Well, I wanted to focus on this group of immigrants because, well, these folks are retiring now. and trying to figure out now what's happening with this group of immigrants who completely changed the demographics of the United States. It was really difficult because very, very few people wanted to talk about them. In other talks, I try to explain why that's the case, but for now, I want to bring up the connection that this has to the Philippines. I want to argue that the return migration of Filipinos didn't happen in 2008 when the housing bubble popped and so many Filipinos now had to face the reality of moving. I want to argue that that moment actually started a long time before 2008. It actually started in 1973. In 1973, the Philippines was experiencing a completely new crisis. Most people don't know this, but up until the late 50s and early 60s, the Philippines was thought of by most people as the pearl of the Orient. Asians who wanted to be educated sent their children to universities in the Philippines, partly because of the devastation that American bombs during World War II did to the infrastructure of the Philippines, but also because of this famous dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. That image of the Philippines being the pearl of the Orient had completely deteriorated. Ferdinand Marcos had always been very powerful, like the current president today, mostly because of his uncanny ability to bring the elite families in the Philippines under his rule and organize them, satiate them. But starting already in 1969, when Marcos was running for re-election, that piece was starting to deteriorate. And in order to be re-elected, he ended up draining the National Bank of all of its money in order to pay for his re-election. This created a huge, obvious economic crisis in the Philippines. But what was interesting was at that very same time, the International Monetary Fund had begun crafting its idea around creating debt economies. And the very first country wasn't Jamaica, it wasn't countries in the Caribbean, it was actually the Philippines that had tested its model around debt economies. And Marcos was happy to get these loans. But unfortunately, as you all know, the story now is that countries can't sustain their economies having to pay every year a debt that they'll never pay off. And so Marcos had to devise different mechanisms in order to pay for these loans, which is why he created an economy that was totally and completely reliant on outmigration. At the same time, however, this very clever president had also thought about what would happen if we were to get all of these Filipinos who had become successful in places like Europe and especially North America to come back. Maybe not to live, but just to visit. So in 1973, Marcos created the Balikbayan program, which gave a very privileged status to elite Filipinos who would come and visit. They could come and visit without any need of a visa. They would get discounts. He wanted to make it easy in every way to enable this circulation of returns to come back to the Philippine economy. I wanted to turn your attention to this quote, which was another huge reference point for me, a poet, Filipino poet and fiction writer named Louis Francia. He wrote this book called Eye of the Fish, and he was trying to tie in and make sense of his lives, both in the United States and in the Philippines. This life that was created because of the Marcos dictatorship. And as he was staring at the Hudson River in New York, where he lives, he wrote this quote, "Initially, I had thought my living abroad, my physical removal to the city by the Hudson had generated this alienation. Alienation that we describe as not just capitalist alienation, but also racism and discrimination." When he reflected on this, he said, "I had gotten it wrong, however. Moving to a different shore was merely the inevitable corollary to a theorem that had already been set. This theorem that had already been set, I want to argue, was set in place not simply from American colonialism, but because of tremendously influential figures like Ferdinand Marcos, who had the vision and the calculus to understand how to sustain a country's economy while doing as little as possible to fix the country itself. My research was a huge undertaking. I literally followed Filipinos who were losing their homes in Daly City back to the Philippines. I studied and tried to capture all of the ways that even before they returned to the Philippines physically, how they ensured that their return would be smooth. Decades of remittances, decades of paying back this affection to their family had done a lot of that labor, had done a lot of that work already. Their yearly visits, and each time they visit, they carry literally 2 boxes of goods from the United States, gifting their family members and neighbors every time that they come back, had also done that work. So Marcos's policy really was just a legal mechanism in order to exploit something that had already been happening. But the other side of this transnational methodology was to understand the connectivity between this, how these material goods become utilized by legislative policies. Not just legislative policies, but means for economic development. And so, while I was in the Philippines for those years, I also studied and interviewed executives, realtors, people who were selling to balikbayans property. Because what I realized was that when I went to the Philippines, nothing was like what I have remembered it to be. The Philippines is completely overwhelmed by transformation. It's so visible. Even stepping off the airplane and going down the escalator in order to exit the main gate of the airport, you're met by this huge wall of advertisement, hoping that you'll invest money in property. And finally, I worked with and interviewed realtors who fly from the Philippines and go to places like Filipino festivals to sell real estate, specifically to Filipino Americans. It's this circulation, this both material and imaginative circulation that I call the balikbayan economy. It's a way of trying to articulate circulations that are always invisible to the eye of policymakers and especially to scholars and academics, because it's just not very important. When you visit the Philippines, it's easy to interpret the changes, the physical changes that are happening around the built environment as the country pulling itself up and improving. But this transformation is a veil in and of itself. Literally, as you walk through the streets and alleyways of the city are hosts of informal developments and squatters. The poverty and inequality that exists in Metro Manila alone is incredibly jarring. And this is the imaginary that's become real for balikbayans as they return to the Philippines. Where did all of my money go? Where did all the work that I have done, where did all of that go? And not only that, balikbayans are also met by this very strange sort of attitude. They encounter this attitude that doesn't treat them as kababayans or country people, right? They're not former Filipinos who are now returning to their home. Suddenly they become quite literally economic opportunities. All over the Philippines, balikbayans are immediately handed brochures and pamphlets just like this that encourage balikbayans to shop and give pasalubong, gifts to their family members. I know you've been doing this for literally decades, but please continue to do that now. Don't just give us gifts. Bring your family members. Here is an incredible program that will allow your family members and your children to enjoy the Philippines so that they'll return in the future too. The former president, Gloria Arroyo, wanted to fully materialize this flow of capital. This is her visiting a retirement village, and retirement villages are very specific. These elite sort of neighborhoods and literal cities are incredible opportunities for the Philippines to divert investments away from households and family members back into the larger economy. This is one of her quotes. She says, "The Philippine retirement industry should find ways to boost the growth of the booming retirement industry in the Philippines. Because the world's graying population is rapidly increasing, the Philippines is in a very good position to take advantage of this potential." As one of the flagship projects of the Philippine government, I want the PRA to boost its efforts to develop and promote the Philippines as a retirement haven. There's already, just in this small quote, the combination of these two important ideas and manifestations. One is the idea of this graying population, not just balikbayans, but all sorts of retirees that are now trying to be exploited by the government. But then there's this too, the fact that retirees themselves are seen by the president as being essential to growing and developing the country's economy. This is another advertisement specifically for these quote-unquote retirement havens, and I just want to quickly direct your view to the images on the right. There's the typical retiree from the United States or from the UK, but also women from Japan. What we're seeing is a huge growth of tourism and investment coming from Korea and Japan, and not just men, but women too. I'll explain that later. And enabling this to happen is this really important visa, the SSRB visa, because in the Philippines, non-Filipinos cannot purchase property yet in the Philippines. So in order to do this, the Philippines created a special visa for elite visitors to be able to travel back and forth from their country to their new country, which is the Philippines, and also to purchase property there and retire. This is a graph of the official data of people who enrolled for these visas. These aren't just balikbayans, these are, like I said, all sorts of flows from different countries. Notice the spike in retirement visas around 2006 and 2008. And then how it sort of trickled down already in 2011 and 2012. It makes complete sense to me that the global economy begins to mirror every other corner and periphery of the world. The Wall Street Journal published an interview with an executive from the Philippine Retirement Authority. Executives are, quote, adamant that over the next 5 years, the overall number of almost 44,000 retirees will jump to over 100,000. As you all know, property development always operates on speculation. When people purchase property, especially abroad, they don't physically get to see the property. They have to imagine it. And when you're being sold this property from abroad, you're being told that these units are going to sell out. So you have to buy it now. And not only will these units sell out, but your income, your investments, the payoff will be huge. Because of this generative flow of speculation, there's all this literature around how to sell property in the Philippines to Filipino Americans. In this book in particular, I found some interesting information. But before that, the author of a lot of these books is a man named Edward Tan. Edward Tan is a relative to one of the most wealthy Filipinos in the Philippines, Chinese Filipinos, I should say, in the Philippines, the fourth wealthiest Filipino in the Philippines. So he was able to draw a lot of data from this, from his relatives, because the primary source of this wealth was through property development. And this is a great graph of not just the developers, but the percentage of the developments that they build that are bought by Filipino Americans. I wanted to also distinguish three types of property that investors usually purchase in the Philippines. It's really important. One are the condominiums that you see everywhere around, especially Metro Manila. These sky rises, while always beautiful from the outside, are actually quite differentiated when you come into them, because some of them are ornate and beautiful, full of not just swimming pools and gyms, but schools and clinics. Sort of a world into itself. But not all of them are like that. I lived in and visited the condominiums that were almost inhabitable. They were beautiful from the outside, but when you go into the unit itself, there's literally no natural lighting anywhere in the apartment. The rooms are not just small, but it's really hard to breathe in the rooms because there's very little air circulation. Then there's the residential lots. These are the actual property where balikbayans and OFWs are able to purchase property and build houses on top of that property. And these types of developments happen usually outside of Metro Manila, and especially around provincial homelands, provinces where migrants come from. But lastly, in this tier of developments that's emerging in the Philippines is something called retirement villages. These are oftentimes entire cities in and unto themselves. They're collections of retirement villages that exist outside of Metro Manila that have everything inside of them. It's almost like going inside of a cruise ship or an all-inclusive sort of touristic environment, because everything is included in these literal cities. This is Eaton City that exists not too far from Manila and Cavite, right next to Tagaytay, another very popular retirement hub. And these are the percentages this year alone that these major corporations and developers had sold property to Filipino Americans. A few things should stand out here. One is that while condominiums in Robinson's Land sold 50% of its units to Filipino Americans, MegaWorld at the bottom only sold 10% of them to Filipino Americans. And that's because MegaWorld caters mostly to OFWs, while Robinson's Land caters specifically to balikbayans. Then there's the 80% of balikbayans who purchase property in retirement villas around Subic Bay. Ayala, arguably the most successful property developer in the Philippines, said it's usually these sales usually happen within 6 months to a year after these Filipino Americans purchase property. But interestingly enough, these Filipino Americans have never physically visited the property in the Philippines. He says they've seen them on things like the Filipino Channel. The Filipino Channel is inarguably the most important virtual network connecting Filipinos to the Philippines. They see these ads for buying property constantly, and these ads continuously play on these two ideas of one's obligation to their nation, but also one's obligation to their family. You see, Marcos was a genius because this term balikbayan had always existed, but Marcos had codified it so that the word home and nation suddenly became one and the same. Returnees weren't just paying respects to their family. Returnees were paying back their obligation to their country, their homeland. How much time do I have?
You could wrap up.
Okay. I'm sorry, this is all like the really great stuff. These are just a few advertisements that really convey both the dual sort of imaginative laboring of living in the Philippines, but not just living in the Philippines, but living in the Philippines, but continuing to experience the United States. There's so many things that I could grab from those ads, and fortunately or unfortunately, you'll just have to buy the book to read it. But the last thing that I want to touch on is why it is that inequality sustains itself in places like Metro Manila. These private corporations and banks were always supposed to operate underneath the federal government of the Philippines. But as you know, because of different modes of governmentality, what's private and what's public is not easily distinguishable. In fact, banks or developers have subsumed banks in and of themselves so that they operate not just in selling property, but they give out loans themselves. Well, these two things have come together to work hand in hand with the federal government in order to sell to these three groups. Through different modalities of transnational realty, the government / private corporations are able to sell to these three groups. And just quickly, allow me to just move through this graph because I just want to talk about one more thing. For balikbayans themselves, what's interesting is that very few of these Filipinos who are returning from the United States actually want to live in Metro Manila. What you'll see at the same time is the vast network of call centers that have emerged in the Philippines. And these call centers are always placed alongside of these condominium developments. What's begun to happen is that balikbayans, they purchase property, but they don't live in that property. They purchase property to the only Filipinos who can afford to live in that property. If they're not Filipinos who come from elite employment, they're from this emergent industry, the call center industry, because call center employees, the supervisors, the ones who work a bit higher than the call centers themselves, can actually afford to live in these condominiums. Most Filipinos returning from the Philippines actually want to return to their provincial homelands or live outside of Metro Manila. What's been created then is an immediate disinvestment of the immediate environment around these condominiums. Because balikbayans who purchase that property are just renting the property, they don't care about what's happening outside of the condominiums themselves. And so the condominium may look very beautiful on the outside, but it's surrounded by poverty and complete degradation. And that never changes. And it doesn't have to change because the balikbayan economy has created a sort of circulation that operates outside of that its own periphery. And that's a tremendous reason why the book itself doesn't end on a happy note, because it's trying to articulate the many ways in which the balikbayan subjectivity, balikbayans themselves, how they see themselves, and also how they're seen by the nation, is actually employed. This imagination is employed and exploited by the Philippine government. Thanks so much.
wonderful talk. The most important thing for me was that it took me back to my own research, which is basically on the Sikh diaspora here in North America. So I have just a couple of quick questions. First is, in the initial segment of your talk, you referred to the Filipino community as immigrant community. I was wondering, is that like a theoretical construct for you, because you did not use diasporic community, and but all the other things that you mentioned, their love for their homeland and eventually going back to the homeland, which are characteristics of a diasporic community. So I just wanted to know the reason for using immigrant and not diaspora. The second question that I had, there are so many similarities with what the remittances are doing in Philippines and with what the remittances are doing in Punjab in India. Perhaps we should collaborate on a paper with that. I was wondering, how are these remittances affecting the class structure in Philippines, particularly like outside of Manila to the countryside? What is it that it's doing? Because what is seen in the rest of, and India is the largest remittance receiving country in the world. So what it has done to the countryside in India is both amazing when you visually look at it and very terrible when you look at the social consequences. So I was wondering if you see something like that happening in Philippines also.
Yeah, thank you so much, Harpreet, for both of your questions. The first question, I personally don't have a lot of problem referring to Filipinos who live outside of the Philippines as diasporic. A lot of scholars in the Philippines, however, are really troubled by that term. And a lot of scholars here in the United States. That term is reserved for very particular groups of people. And I think a lot of that tension is around the emotional tie that the group of Filipinos have to the Philippines and how it's continually materializes itself in the present. Whereas folks perhaps in the African or Jewish diaspora sort of were forced for different reasons outside globally, Filipinos, at least theoretically, can always return. However, this idea of balikbayans, I hope, sort of troubles all of those ideas, because when you're a balikbayan, you're quite literally a tourist in your home of origin. And so trying to understand how one connects to that homeland comes up in very interesting ways. Filipinos who are returning, when you asked about this idea of the effect of remittances, one of the effects is that Filipinos who return, it doesn't matter how wealthy or not wealthy you are. As soon as you come back from the United States, you're already seen as wealthy. And so you are subsequently sort of, at least in their minds, a target of all sorts of exploitation. So that's there's this entire economy that I write about in my book of bringing with you security guards or drivers, or staying at hotels that are specifically for balikbayans, so that you can maintain this idea of the Philippines from back home that you grew up in the 40s. But the other sort of effect that's happened is the kind of effect that remittances have had on community formation. One of the most beautiful, in my opinion, beautiful aspects of sort of Filipino community formation is this idea of bayanihan. And in a lot of previous, even suburban developments, where the emergence of something that's very old and pre-colonial called barangays. And barangays are kind of its own welfare network. So Filipinos would take care of themselves, look out for one another in case somebody was getting their house burglarized. But what these remittances have often done was, Teresa Caldera talks about the city of walls. You know, they pay for these security systems that literally wall the homes. So physically, you're demarcated from the community, and people who walk by can no longer sort of interact with you, which is a huge part of Filipino culture. But in a micro sort of way, those remittances end up being given to the family members, but it never finds itself coming out to the barangay. So families, you'll go into a neighborhood, and there will be houses that you can immediately identify as balikbayan houses because they're beautiful, but they're also surrounded by very poor households. And so that phenomenon, the very neoliberal phenomenon of individualism has also been produced by remittances.
I'm so interested in how both the remittances from the professional class and then those from the overseas Filipino workers have ultimately impacted the strength and the issues of inequality in the Philippines community, which, as you say, from Marcos's time was a disaster, if you will, and grinding poverty led to these programs, and with the hope that this money would just come in without there having to be any sustained reforms within the country. So you said that really articulately, and I'm just wondering, again, you talked about transformation. We know about the inequality of globalization. We know that it's startling when you, but is there some sense, because of the huge numbers that we're talking about, that it really is reaching in to the Visayas and the Mindanaos and the Cebus, and is it getting there? Is it getting to Negros Occidental and so forth? Or is it really just Metro Manila and that area that is prospering, and even within there, there's inequality? I mean, are the numbers great enough that we're seeing some economic development come from this in the periphery?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important. I didn't get to show you one of those slides, but it's important to note that OFWs who come from poorer regions of the Philippines have been sending money for decades to their provincial neighborhoods and households. And the New York Times and the Guardian have these incredible articles about Little Sicily popping up in Cebu, or Little Italy. These OFWs who worked in Italy as domestic workers, they come back, and decades of their remittances have marked the architecture, so it feels like you're looking at a Little Italy. I think it's easy to look at how that trickles down to certain spaces in the Philippines and become very optimistic, because it's an amazing thing for a Filipino living abroad to be able to take care of their family in the Philippines. There's this intense indebtedness and guilt that one has for leaving the Philippines when it feels that way. But unfortunately, all of these happen in sort of a way that enables things to go along as it always has. And that's sort of the troubling nature, I think, of remittances, and why social scientists really struggle with trying to understand its positive effects. Because even though we have these remittance economies, the local economies themselves, there's no way to take hold of this capital, because it's always draining into other areas of the economy, both because of legislative policies, but also because of this sort of individualism that's propping up too. Yeah.
Hey, I really appreciated your discussion of national policy. It's been several initiatives, it seems like, that have produced this outcome, and I'm wondering if you have a normative stance on the policy, and if you were to be advising the president or have these different immigrant groups as your audience, what you'd advise.
I think it's interesting, because I was asked years ago if Filipinos should buy property. And I think I didn't really know how to answer that question in 2009, except to say no. But I think that there's two interesting things if I was sort of not kind of have a immediately critical position on this. One, what's happening in the Philippines is that every country has to rely on its sort of unique export sort of channel, right? Its flow of export. And it just so happens that countries like the Philippines, actual people are its primary sort of export good. I hate to say that, but that's what it is. And if you think about it in an economic sense, each of these countries, especially as they're located outside of the view of global capital, are desperately trying to figure out how do we maintain our foothold in the global economy and maintain our competitiveness in the global economy. Well, what's ended up happening is that, especially now with the new president, the Philippines is moving more and more away from its reliance on the United States and moving closer and closer to its reliance on places like China and Japan. And migration, relying on out-migration and exporting migration allows the Philippines to do that and sort of have some role in the global conversation.
No question. So, what did you find people either in the Philippines or in the U.S. who were critical of this? You know, what avenues are there for people who don't want to live in one of those retirement villas, but do want to be a hero in some other way? And is that happening at all? And
Yes. And one of the most progressive and important sort of intellectual centers in the Philippines is the University of Philippines in Diliman. And for years, there's been this culture. If you graduate from the University of Diliman, a lot of students feel this way. You don't leave the Philippines. You stay in the Philippines and you work with what you have, especially since you're so privileged educationally. And these different groups have figured out sort of alternative ways to kind of think about transformation in Manila. And I could talk about that in different ways later. But what's troubling and really complicated is sort of the ambivalent relationship that especially the second and third generation of Filipino Americans have towards the Philippines. Balikbayans, you can already imagine, they didn't come here because they were necessarily fleeing the dictatorship. They came to the United States to make a better life for themselves, and a lot of them have. And that's really incredible. And so when they think about the Philippines, there's a quote that I wanted to show where there's a lot of cynicism around what the Philippines is, because that's the Philippines that they remember it to be. The ambivalence and difficulty around sort of creating transnational modalities of activism and social transformation is that a lot of Filipino Americans and Filipino American activists imagine the Philippines as if what it looked like in 1987, right? That it's never changed. It's always been corrupt. It's always dirty. It's just a lost cause. And so that sort of core periphery, sort of American-centric kind of imagination has hindered a lot of the ways that Filipino Americans can work with Filipinos, because Filipinos in the Philippines already feel like they look down on them. They're condescending. You know, it's just sort of this post-colonial remanufacturing of a colonial model, you know. And so that's created a lot of obstacles for really salient and powerful transnational activism that could happen. 60%, depending on what number that you look at, 60% of Metro Manila alone is homeless. This problem of landlessness has always, since Spanish colonialism, been a problem in the Philippines, because property has been the fundamental way that Filipinos have elite Filipinos have sustained their eliteness. And so all kinds of activism have, for generations, been trying to address this issue of landlessness. And it's no different now.
I have one quick question. Just, you talked a lot about the conspicuous consumption and so forth, the TVs and the property and all that, but there are some, I'm just wondering if the Philippines has looked at Mexico or some of the other models where the governments, there's something called 2 por 1, 3 por 1, 4 por 1, that for every remittance dollar, the government will put in 2 in a productive investment in the village of origin of that person to try to match to try to encourage remittances that go into productive investments like irrigation or maybe land management or something like that. And I don't know whether the Philippines are just stuck on the private consumption model.
Not at all. I mean, like I said, Filipino families take responsibility a lot to fixing devastated parts of their homeland when catastrophes happen. So there are formal channels where the government literally takes money from flows of remittances. We don't know where that money goes to, so that happens. But there's already a known culture of Filipinos in the diaspora giving charity to local infrastructure improvement projects. And these are clinics and schools, not just repairing roads, but the labor is done a lot of times by diasporic Filipinos. And every year, emissaries from the Philippines come to try to get charity money from Filipinos living abroad for this very reason.
I think we'll have to stop here, but Eric will be around for a few minutes if people have other questions. And again, the books are available, so please join me in thanking Professor Pido.
Every talk always ends this way, just like this.
Quick technical thing. I loved the actual PowerPoint itself, the way you what program?
So it's the one that comes from